1,000 warriors, armoured, ruthless, advancing with swords raised, and one man, unarmed, bound, humiliated, until the heavens opened, until the Spirit of the Lord surged like fire through his veins. The ropes snapped, his enemies laughed, until they saw what he held in his hand. Not a sword, not a spear, but the jawbone of a donkey, and with it he brought 1,000 men to their knees. Flesh met bone. Earth trembled. Blood stained the dust. They had never seen power like this, not from a king, not from an army, from one man, chosen before birth, a man whose strength was sacred, a man called Samson. But before the warrior there was a promise, a barren woman, a divine vow, and a birth that would change everything. She was just a woman in the shadows, unseen, unheard, and forgotten by time. In the quiet village of Zorah, sorrow had made a home in her soul. The other women had children, laughter filled their homes. But hers, only silence. For years she had prayed. For years heaven had been quiet, until today. As the sun dipped low and the world began to dim, a strange glow filled the air, not the glow of fire nor of any lamp. It was pure, alive, divine, and then she saw him. An angel of the Lord, radiant and overwhelming, stood before her. No weapon in his hand, no fury in his eyes, only light, holy light. His robe shimmered like stars wrapped in cloth. His voice didn't echo. It settled in her chest like a whisper from eternity. "You are barren," he said gently, "but you shall conceive and bear a son." But this would not be just any child. This son would be a Nazirite, set apart from the womb. No wine would touch his lips. No razor would ever graze his skin, because heaven had spoken to a barren woman and called her womb holy. Manoah and wife received the prophecy together. A warm golden light breaks through the twilight as the angel reappears in their living room. Manoah and his wife kneel on the dry ground, trembling, eyes wide with reverent awe. The angel stands tall and radiant, the figure wrapped in glowing celestial white and gold, divine and unearthly. Around them everything was quiet and gentle, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. Manoah's wife overcome with emotion. Manoah beside her, his hand shielding his tear-filled eyes from the brightness. The angel raises one hand and a soft ring of light pulses outward. No words are heard, just a moment suspended in the holy silence of prophecy. Their faces reflect a sacred mix of fear, hope, and trembling joy as the angel disappears. And just as the angel had said, it came to pass. The once empty home now echoed with the cry of a newborn, loud, strong, defiant, a cry that seemed to shake the very silence that had weighed on that household for so long. His mother and then his father held him close, trembling, not from fear but from reverence. This was no ordinary child. This was the child promised by heaven, the child of prophecy, a Nazirite. As he wrapped him in soft linen, his fingers brushed his dark, thick hair, already long for a child so small. Even now it grew freely, untouched by any blade. His hair would not be cut, not ever. It was the symbol of his calling, the sign of a covenant made between the child and the God of Israel. His father, Manoah, stood solemnly by the altar, arms open to the heavens. With every breath he thanked the God who turns sorrow into strength. They named him Samson, sunlight. Because this child had broken through 40 years of oppression like the dawn through a long night. And on that sacred day they dedicated him, not just with words but with surrender. He would not belong to them, he would belong to God. Even as a baby, his destiny was already unfolding, not in sword or battle yet, but in the quiet promise of a vow that would shape the course of a nation. As the years passed, the boy grew, strong, wild, and full of wonder. But there was something about Samson, something different. He didn't just play like other children. He ran as though the wind followed him. He climbed the rocky hills of Zorah as though the stones themselves moved aside for his feet, and his hair flowed behind him like a river of shadow and glory, long, dark, untamed. It whispered of something sacred. He knew he was called, though he didn't yet understand how. Each morning he would disappear into the hills, barefoot, fearless. The sun would rise on his shoulders as he chased the silence of the wilderness, chasing something deeper, something ancient. Villagers would watch from afar and whisper, "That's the Nazirite boy," the one the angel foretold. And as he walked alone but never lonely, he would sometimes hear distant echoes, a lion's roar in the wind, the rustle of unseen danger, but there was no fear in him, not yet. For in those early days, before the battle, before the heartbreak, before the fall, Samson was still just a boy walking with destiny, his footsteps echoing across the stones of promise and the Spirit of the Lord already beginning to stir within him. It was on one of those quiet walks when the earth held its breath. Samson wandered into the vineyards of Timnah, the sun low, the shadows long. His heart was calm, his thoughts distant until the silence shattered. From the brush came a roar, primal and furious. A young lion, lean and hungry, burst from the undergrowth, its golden eyes locked on him, its claws tore at the earth, it pounced. But Samson did not run. In that moment something ancient awoke within him. The Spirit of the Lord surged like fire through his veins. His muscles tightened and his heart thundered, not with fear but with holy power. He met the beast mid-air. With bare hands he seized the lion's mane, its teeth flashing inches from his face. He twisted, wrestled, roared back. The lion shrieked, but it was over in moments. With a strength not born of flesh, Samson tore the predator apart as one might tear a young goat. And then silence again. His chest rose and fell, his hands were stained, his long dark hair clung to his skin in sweaty strands, and no one, not his father, not his mother, ever knew what had happened there. But heaven did. This was no ordinary boy. This was the beginning of a legend time past. The sun returned to its throne above Timnah, and the wind once again whispered through the vineyards. Samson walked the same path, older now, stronger, yet still marked by something only he and God understood. He approached the place where the lion had fallen. Curiosity pulled him off the trail. And there it was, the carcass dried and hollowed by the sun. But what he found inside was no longer death, it was sweetness. A swarm of bees had made their home in the ribcage of the slain beast. Golden honey glistened in the bone, like treasure hidden in ruin. With a quiet awe, Samson reached into the hollow remains and scooped the thick nectar into his hand. He ate, slowly, deliberately. The honey dripped from his fingers as if creation itself was offering him a secret. From death came sweetness. He carried some back to his parents, but told them nothing of where it came from. No one knew that behind that sweetness lay the echo of a roar, and a reminder of who Samson was becoming. The wedding feast roared with laughter, music, and the scent of roasted meat. Foreign tongues clashed like swords across the banquet tables. Philistine nobles raised their goblets, unaware that the man at the centre of it all, the towering Nazirite with the long, wild hair, was no ordinary groom. Samson sat among them, half in shadow, eyes gleaming not with joy, but with challenge. He had not forgotten the lion, he had not forgotten the honey, and now he would wrap both in a riddle. Rising to his feet, his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Let me tell you a riddle," he said, lifting his cup. "If you can solve it within the 7 days of this feast, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. But if you cannot, then you will give me the same." The guests leaned in, their smiles sharpened by arrogance. Samson spoke slowly, each word soaked in mystery. "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." The room fell quiet. The riddle was sealed, and in that silence, beneath the celebration, a storm began to stir, one that would crack foundations and test loyalties, because this was no ordinary feast, and Samson was no ordinary man. They thought they could outwit him. For 7 days the Philistines hounded his new bride. Whispers turned to threats. Smiles turned to scorn. And in the final hour they cracked her spirit. She begged, she cried. And Samson, wearied by her weeping, gave away his secret. They answered the riddle. But it wasn't victory they had won. It was vengeance they had summoned. Samson's eyes blazed, not with surprise, but with fury. He knew betrayal when he tasted it, and now he would repay it. He left the feast in silence, his fists clenched, his spirit stirred by wrath. He travelled down to Ashkelon, a Philistine stronghold. There, without warning, without mercy, Samson descended upon 30 men. He did not wait for a fight. He was the fight. Their swords meant nothing. Their armour crumpled under his blows. The ground turned red beneath his feet as he tore through them like a tempest of divine rage. 30 men fell. Their garments, torn, blooded, were carried back by a man who spoke no words, whose hands were stained, not just with battle, but with justice. He threw the garments at the feet of those who had deceived him. "This is your prize," his eyes seemed to say, and then he turned from them. But he did not return to his bride. Not this time, because something in him had shifted. This was no longer about riddles. This was war. The wheat was ripening in the fields. It was the season of harvest, when joy should fill the villages and grain should fill the barns. But Samson's heart was not full of joy. It was full of fire. He had returned to find his bride, only to learn she had been given to another, his own companion, a fresh betrayal, an insult layered on injury. They thought they could humiliate him and walk away untouched. But they had forgotten who he was. They had forgotten the strength, not just of his arms, but of his wrath. Samson did not strike with a sword. No, he struck with flame. He went into the hills, trapping foxes, 300 of them, wild and swift. He tied them tail to tail, a torch fastened between each pair. He released the foxes into the standing grain, into the vineyards, into the olive groves. And then he watched. The fields that once danced in the breeze now roared in flames. Smoke climbed into the heavens like incense, only this offering was not of peace, but of judgment. The Philistines screamed as their wealth, their food, their pride was reduced to ash. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to the space between Samson and the lion. The air crackled with unspoken power, the scent of wild beast mingling with the sweet aroma of grapes. The lion pawed at the ground, its growl rumbling through the vineyard, a challenge issued and accepted. But Samson did not flinch. He felt no fear, only a strange sense of exhilaration, a primal urge to meet this challenge head-on. In that moment he was not a man facing a beast, but two forces of nature colliding. The lion lunged, its roar echoing across the hills. Samson met its charge, his own roar erupting from his chest, a sound that spoke of ancient power, of a strength that transcended the limitations of flesh and bone. He grabbed the lion's jaws, his grip like iron, and with a surge of adrenaline he tore the beast apart. The sound of snapping bones filled the air, a gruesome symphony of death and divine power. The air hung heavy with the weight of betrayal. Samson, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, allowed himself to be bound. His own people, driven by fear, had become instruments of his captivity. Their hands, calloused and work-worn, trembled as they wound the rough ropes around his wrists. They averted their eyes, unable to meet his gaze, their shame a tangible presence in the air. He could have resisted. With a flex of his mighty arms, he could have shattered their flimsy restraints and sent them scattering like chaff before the wind. But what purpose would it serve? To break their bodies, but not their fear. No, he would let them bind him. He would become a symbol of their weakness, their capitulation to the Philistine yoke. But in their surrender, he would find a way to remind them of their strength, their forgotten covenant with God. The ropes bit into his flesh, a constant reminder of his people's betrayal. They had come to him not with songs of praise or pleas for liberation, but with fear-laced whispers and the tools of his confinement. He, the mighty judge of Israel, stood before them a captive, his strength seemingly nullified by their flimsy bonds. Yet beneath the surface a storm brewed, a storm of righteous anger, of divine purpose, waiting to be unleashed. He looked upon their faces, etched with a mixture of fear and misguided relief, and a profound sadness washed over him. They had forgotten who they were, what they were capable of. They had traded their birthright for a fragile peace, a peace that would crumble as surely as the walls of Jericho. But he would remind them, he would show them that true strength lay not in the might of arms, but in the unwavering faith in the God of their fathers. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape as they led him away. He walked in silence, his bare feet kicking up dust, the weight of their betrayal a heavy cloak upon his shoulders. They had bound his hands, but they could not bind his spirit. They could deliver him into the hands of his enemies, but they could not extinguish the divine spark that burned within him. His hair, untouched by any blade, flowed behind him like a banner of defiance. It was a symbol of his vow, his sacred covenant with God, a covenant that transcended the limitations of human frailty and fear. With each step he took, he drew strength from the unseen. The God who had parted the Red Sea, who had toppled the walls of Jericho, walked beside him, an unshakable presence in the face of overwhelming odds. They handed him over to the Philistines like a common criminal, a lamb to the slaughter. The jeers of his captors, their laughter laced with malice, washed over him, but he remained unmoved. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of triumph and apprehension, followed his every move. They had heard the tales of his strength, witnessed the aftermath of his wrath. They approached him with a caution that belied their outward bravado. He offered no resistance as they bound him once more, their ropes replacing those of his own people. They led him through the throng, a spectacle for their amusement, a trophy to be paraded before their false gods. But beneath their mocking laughter he sensed their fear. They had imprisoned his body, but they could not contain the storm that raged within him. They had delivered him into darkness, but they were about to witness the dawn. The roar of the crowd, triumphant laughter washed over him like a physical force. He stood in the centre of the arena, a lone figure amidst a sea of hostile faces. Their eyes, gleaming with anticipation, followed his every move, their laughter fueled by the illusion of victory. They had come to witness his humiliation, to bask in the supposed downfall of their enemy. They had chained him, bound him, stripped him of his strength, or so they believed. How little they understood. They had mistaken restraint for defeat, silence for surrender. They had underestimated the power that flowed through him, the unbreakable covenant that bound him to the God of his fathers. A hush fell over the crowd as their laughter died down. In the sudden silence, Samson closed his eyes, blocking out the sea of faces, the weight of their hatred. He focused inward, seeking the still, small voice that whispered amidst the storm. He had walked through fire, faced down lions, toppled the strongholds of his enemies, but this moment of utter vulnerability, this surrender to a force beyond his control, this was his greatest test. His captors, their faces with a mixture of anticipation and unease, watched him intently. They sensed a shift in the atmosphere, tension that hung heavy in the air. They had expected resistance, a display of brute force, a desperate struggle against the inevitable. They had not anticipated this stillness, this quiet acceptance, this communion with an unseen power. The ground trembled beneath their feet. It began as a subtle vibration, a disquiet in the earth itself. The Philistines, their laughter choked off mid-jeer, exchanged uneasy glances. The air with unseen energy, the very atmosphere seemed to thrum with a power that defied explanation, a power that spoke of ancient covenants and divine intervention. Samson's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a light that was not of this world. The ropes that bound him, once taut with the expectation of containment, slackened as if suddenly imbued with a life of their own. With a roar that shook the heavens, Samson broke free. His bonds, no match for the surge of divine power that coursed through him, disintegrated, reduced to dust and scattered by the wind. He stood before them no longer a captive but a vessel of righteous fury, a living embodiment of God's unwavering might. The crowd gasped. Everyone's breath filled the air like a wave, bouncing off the stone walls around them. They scrambled back, their fear a tangible presence, their faces pale masks of terror. Samson, his eyes blazing with a fire that could consume nations, surveyed the scene. He had been bound, betrayed, delivered into the hands of his enemies, but in their moment of supposed triumph, they had unwittingly become architects of their own destruction. He was unleashed. The Philistines faltered. Their mocking laughter died in their throats. They had expected a fight, a desperate struggle from a cornered animal. They had not anticipated this. Samson, free from his bonds, radiated a power that sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't just his physique, although it was indeed formidable. No, it was something more, something ancient, something terrifying. Their eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything to hold back the storm they knew was about to break. But there was nothing. Samson's gaze swept across the arena. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, now blazed with a cold fire. He saw not men, but obstacles, not captors, but targets. And then he saw it. A hush fell over the arena. Even the Philistine soldiers, hardened by years of warfare, held their breath. They had heard the whispers, the tales of Samson's strength. Now they were about to witness it firsthand. Samson bent down, his long hair cascading down his back like a waterfall of darkness. He picked up the jawbone, feeling its weight in his hand. It was a crude weapon, unrefined, almost comical in its simplicity. But in Samson's grip it became something more. It became an extension of his will, a conduit for the divine fury that coursed through his veins. He hefted the jawbone, testing its balance, a grim smile spreading across his face. The Philistines, sensing their impending doom, backed away, their formation crumbling like sandcastles before a tidal wave. A harvest of souls. The silence shattered. With a roar that echoed through the valley, Samson charged. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his size, a whirlwind of righteous fury unleashed upon the unsuspecting Philistines. The jawbone became a blur, a weapon of bone and divine wrath. It crashed through shields, shattered swords, and found its mark again and again. The Philistines, their ranks broken, could only stumble back in terror. They had never witnessed such ferocity, such raw, untamed power. Samson moved through their ranks like a reaper in a field of wheat, leaving a trail of broken bodies and shattered armor in his wake. No escape from fury. The arena, once a stage for Philistine amusement, had become a slaughterhouse. The ground ran slick with blood, the air thick with the coppery tang of death. But Samson showed no mercy. He had been betrayed, humiliated, stripped of his honor. Now he would have his vengeance. The Philistines, their initial bravado long forgotten, broke ranks and ran. They scrambled over the bodies of their fallen comrades, desperate to escape the wrath of the man they had so confidently underestimated. But there was no escape. Samson, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any earthly fire, pursued them relentlessly. He was a force of nature unleashed, an instrument of divine retribution. Whispers of retribution. Word of the massacre at Lehi spread like wildfire. From village to village the whispers travelled, carried on the wind, etched into the very fabric of the land. Samson had become a legend, his name whispered in hushed tones, a mixture of awe and terror. The Philistines, once so confident in their power, trembled at the mere mention of his name. But Samson took no joy in his victory. The carnage at Lehi, the blood that stained his hands, weighed heavily upon his soul. He had become an instrument of death, a harbinger of destruction. Was this his destiny, to be forever bound to the cycle of violence and vengeance? He had sought solace in solitude, seeking refuge in the wilderness that had always been his sanctuary. But even there, he could not escape the memories, the echoes of screams, the faces of the fallen. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a suffocating burden that threatened to crush his spirit. He had tasted vengeance, but it had left a bitter aftertaste in his mouth. The victory at Lehi had come at a terrible price. He had become what he had sworn to destroy, a bringer of death, a sower of chaos. The whispers followed him, a constant reminder of his deeds, his name forever linked to the bloodshed at the arena. He wandered the wilderness, seeking answers in the whispers of the wind, in the stoic silence of the ancient rocks. But the only answer he found was the echo of his own despair. The world seemed to shrink around him, his once boundless energy constricted by the chains of his guilt. The laughter that had once come so easily now stuck in his throat, replaced by a heavy silence. He had become a prisoner of his own making, his heart a desolate wasteland, his spirit shrouded in ashes. The whispers continued, but they no longer spoke of his strength. Now they whispered of his burden, his fall from grace. He had tasted victory, but it had turned to ashes in his mouth. He had sought to break the chains of oppression, but in doing so he had forged new chains for himself. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to extinguish the last embers of his hope. He had become a paradox, a liberator bound by his own rage, a judge who had condemned himself. And in the silence of his self-imposed exile he began to understand the true cost of vengeance. It was a price paid, not in blood and bone, but in the very essence of one's soul. A cold wind blew through the wilderness, carrying with it a new kind of silence, the silence of fear, the silence of anticipation, the silence before a storm. Samson, hidden in his self-imposed exile, felt the shift in the air. It wasn't the familiar caress of the desert wind, but something colder, sharper, something that smelled of smoke and whispered of distant screams. He had sought refuge in solitude, seeking respite from the horrors he had unleashed. But some wounds ran too deep to be healed by isolation. Some scars throbbed in time with the beat of vengeance. The whispers found him, carried on the wind, weaving their way through the rocky crags and canyons of his sanctuary. They spoke of fire and fury, of retribution swift and terrible. He climbed to the highest point, his bare feet finding purchase on the treacherous slopes with the ease of a mountain goat. Below him, the wilderness stretched out like a wrinkled tapestry, a landscape as unforgiving as his thoughts, and then he saw it. In the distance, a beacon of flame pierced the twilight sky. It pulsed with an angry light, casting dancing shadows across the barren landscape. It was a beacon he knew all too well, a beacon he had ignited countless times before. But this fire was different. This fire spoke of loss. This fire whispered a name. His heart, already heavy with guilt, lurched in his chest. A cold dread settled over him, chilling him to the bone. He ran. Driven by a primal fear he couldn't name, he raced toward the inferno that lit up the night sky. The jagged rocks tore at his feet, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't slow down. Each step was a hammer blow to his chest, each breath a searing reminder of his own mortality. He had faced down armies, torn lions limb from limb, but this terror that gnawed at his insides was something altogether more terrifying. The closer he got, the more intense the heat became, until it felt like the very air itself was on fire. The smell of burning wood filled his nostrils, acrid and suffocating. And then he saw it. Ashes of betrayal. The house was engulfed in flames, a pyre of wood and stone consumed by the serpent's kiss. He knew that house. He knew the shape of its doorway, the way the light used to spill from its windows, but now it was nothing more than a charred skeleton, a monument to loss and betrayal. The laughter that had once echoed within its walls was now replaced by the crackle of flames and the hiss of dying embers. He searched frantically for her, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out her name, but his voice was lost in the roar of the fire. And then he saw them. Two figures, barely recognizable beneath a shroud of ash and flame, lay entwined near what was once the hearth. Their embrace, frozen in time, spoke of love and sacrifice, of a bond broken by forces beyond their control. from the depths. Samson had sought to avenge his own pain, to right the wrongs inflicted upon him, but in doing so he had unleashed a force that consumed everything in its path. He had become the very thing he swore to destroy, a bringer of chaos, a harbinger of death. The weight of his actions, the realization that he had been both the instrument and the architect of this tragedy, threatened to crush him. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And from that abyss, from the depths of his despair, a new kind of fury began to stir. The fury of the bereaved. He had known rage before. He had tasted vengeance and felt its fleeting satisfaction. But this was different. This was the fury of the bereaved, the righteous anger of a man who has lost everything. The guilt that had gnawed at his insides was now consumed by a white-hot rage. He had embraced his role as God's instrument, but in doing so he had become a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. No longer. He would wield his strength, not for personal gain or fleeting vengeance, but for justice. He would become a whirlwind of retribution, a tempest of divine wrath, unleashed upon those who had wronged him, who had taken from him that which he held most dear. He rose from the ashes, his body a weapon forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. The whispers followed him, no longer tinged with fear, but with a newfound respect, a grudging admiration for the storm they had helped to create. He would make them pay. Every Philistine soldier, every nobleman, every citizen who had cheered for his downfall would taste the bitter fruit of their actions. He would become a plague upon their houses, a terror in the night. He would paint the streets of their cities red with their blood. He would tear down their temples and salt their earth. He would make them rue the day they crossed Samson, son of Manoah, judge of Israel. He disappeared into the night, a shadow swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. But his legend, fueled by whispers and tales of righteous fury, continued to grow. He became a ghost story, whispered around Philistine campfires. A boogeyman used to frighten children into obedience. He was the vengeance that lurked in the shadows, the justice that struck swift and without mercy. And in the hearts of his enemies a seed of fear was planted. A fear that would grow with each passing day, fueled by the knowledge that Samson, the lion they thought they had tamed, was still out there, waiting, watching. Panic swept through the arena. The Philistines, their formation shattered, became a thrashing sea of fear. They had come to witness a spectacle. Now they were trapped in a nightmare. Samson, no longer a man but a force of nature, waded into the panicked throng. His fists, hardened by years of toil and tempered in the fires of vengeance, became instruments of divine wrath. He moved with a speed and ferocity that defied comprehension. One moment he was before them, the next he was a blur, a whirlwind of destruction cutting a swathe through their ranks. Screams filled the air, blending with the sickening thud of bone on bone. The stench of blood and fear hung heavy, a gruesome offering to the god of war. But Samson was not fighting for a god of war, he was fighting for something more. The battle raged. Hours melted away like wax before a flame, but Samson did not tire. He was a vessel, filled to the brim with divine power, and that power showed no sign of waning. 1,000 Philistines fell before his wrath. Their bodies, broken and lifeless, littered the arena floor like fallen leaves after a storm. But still he fought on. He had become an avatar of vengeance, his every blow a testament to the pain and betrayal he had endured. But even as he fought, a small part of him, buried deep beneath the rage and the grief, recoiled from the carnage he was unleashing. He was a judge, not an executioner, a liberator, not a destroyer. But was there a difference anymore? The arena, once a symbol of Philistine might, now shook with the violence of Samson's fury. Cracks spiderwebbed across the once imposing walls, testament to the ungodly strength coursing through his veins. The Philistine leaders, their faces pale with terror, huddled together like frightened children. They had underestimated their captive mistaken restraint for weakness. Now they were paying the price. Samson, his breath ragged but his spirit unbroken, paused in his rampage. He surveyed the scene, his gaze falling upon the two massive pillars that supported the arena roof. An idea, terrible in its simplicity, bloomed in his mind. He had struck down their warriors, shattered their pride. Now he would bring their temple of blood crashing down upon them. With a roar that seemed to split the heavens, Samson lunged for the pillars. He wrapped his massive arms around the cold stone, feeling the weight of the structure pressing down upon him. He dug his heels into the blood-soaked sand, his muscles straining with a power that defied the limitations of flesh and bone. And then, with a final earth-shattering heave, he pulled. The pillars groaned, their foundations crumbling under the onslaught of his impossible strength. The ground buckled, throwing the terrified Philistines off their feet, and then the world dissolved into dust and silence. The dust settled, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The once mighty arena was no more, reduced to a pile of rubble beneath a cloudless sky. The silence, heavy and absolute, was broken only by the whisper of the wind as it sifted through the ruins. There were no cheers of victory, no songs of triumph, only the ghosts of the fallen and the lingering scent of blood and dust. Samson, his body broken but his spirit unbroken, lay buried beneath the rubble. He had delivered his people, but at a terrible cost. He had embraced his destiny, but in doing so he had become a harbinger of death. Was this the legacy he had envisioned, a wasteland of his own making? Word of Samson's final act spread like wildfire across the land. From village to village, the whispers travelled, carried on the wind, etched into the very fabric of history. The Philistines, their power broken, retreated into the shadows, their dreams of conquest shattered amidst the ruins of the arena. The Israelites, freed from their oppressors, emerged from hiding, their hearts a mixture of awe and trepidation. They had witnessed the fulfillment of prophecy, the terrible power of the God who had chosen a flawed, broken man to be their deliverer. They had tasted freedom, but it had come at a terrible price. Samson's name would forever be etched in their memory, a symbol of both their strength and their capacity for self-destruction. In the end, Samson's greatest victory was not achieved through brute strength but through surrender. He had raged against the chains that bound him, both literal and metaphorical. But it was only when he yielded to a power greater than himself that he was truly free. He had been a flawed hero, driven by passion and prone to violence. But in his flaws, in his humanity, he had embodied the struggles of his people. He had shown them that even in their darkest hour, even when faced with overwhelming odds, they were not alone. The God of their fathers, the God who had delivered them from slavery, the God who had chosen a shepherd boy to be their king, had not abandoned them. He had sent them a judge, a liberator, a flawed but ultimately faithful servant. Samson's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that true strength lies not in physical prowess, but in the unwavering belief in a power greater than ourselves. It is a story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of a man who wrestled with his demons and emerged, however briefly, victorious. He was a legend, yes, but he was also a man capable of great love and terrible wrath, a man who lived and died by a code, a covenant that transcended the limitations of his time. And in the end, his story is not about destruction, but about hope, the hope that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, a single spark of faith can ignite a fire that will burn for generations to come. Samson, a legend unleashed. His name a whisper on the wind, his legacy etched in stone and carried in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a world free from oppression. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment and